Hello, all of you. This is Shankar Reddy, lecturer in political science from Government Junior College for Girls, Maredpalli, Secunderabad. Today we are going to discuss second year Civics first unit, that was Indian Constitution Historical Context. In this already we covered some of the topics. At present topic we will try to cover the Governments of India Acts such as 1909 Indian Council Act, 1919 Government of India Act, 1935 Government of India Act, 1947 Indian Independence Act. So these are the acts which are included in our syllabus. So why we are going to discuss about these acts in the first unit? Because the Constitution of India is developed during the period of British colonial rule. For the making of constitution developments or reforms in India, the Britishers formulated some of the acts such as 1909, you know very well, 1919, 1935, 1947, up to the India's Independence Act. And before going to that, we have to refer there are lots of acts which are passed by the Britishers from the beginning of 1773 Regulating Act. So this is the first and the foremost act formulated by the Britishers to introduce some reforms in India. Then afterwards 1784 Pitt's India Act. With this they modified some of the reforms which are introduced in India already 1773 Regulating Act. Then afterwards they formulated some charter acts such as 1793, 1813, 1833, 1853. They are called as charter acts. With these charter acts they introduced some of the reforms in India. Then after the Charter Acts, they formulated some Council Acts such as 1862 Council Act and also 1892 Council Act and the Government of India Act 1858 and the Indian Council Act 1909, the Government of India Act 1919, the Government of India Act 1935, and finally the Indian Independence Act 1947. Let us try to understand one by one here. The first and the foremost act according to our syllabus is that the Indian Council Act 1909. This act is popularly known as Minto-Marley Reforms Act. The Indian Government Act or Indian Council Act, popularly known as, it was called as Minto-Marley Reforms Act. Here who is the Minto, who is the Marley? Here Lord Minto is the Viceroy and Governor General of India at that time, and Lord Marley is the Secretary of State for India at that time. That's why they contributed for making of the Indian Council Act. That's why on the name of Marley Minto, Minto Marley, this act is popularly known as Minto Marley Reforms or Marley Minto Reforms Act. On the request of moderates and the Muslims also, the British Parliament formulated this act for introducing some reforms in India. Let us try to understand what are the reforms introduced by this act. The main provisions of 1909 Act, Indian Council Act. One is, by this act they increased the strength of Central Legislative Council. Central Legislative Council from 16 to 60. So you know very well, already we discussed in moderate phase, their major demand is that increasement of the strength of Central Legislative Council. So for satisfying moderates, they formulated Indian Council Act 1909. By this act, they increased strength of Central Legislative Council from 16 to 60. At the same time, provincial legislative councils, which are existed in state level, as minimum strength, they increased as minimum 30 to maximum 52. Number of members which are included in provincial legislative council is that minimum 30 and the maximum is that 52. This is the first and the foremost important provision of the 1909 Act. At the same time, by the Act of 1909, they introduced communal representation for Muslims. Communal representation for Muslims. And what is the communal representation here? The communal representation, which is the representation based on religion. Based on religion. So here, according to the request of the Muslim leagues, the British government introduced separate electorates, separate constituencies for the Muslims by the act of Minto-Marley reforms. That's why Lord Minto is considered as the father of communal representation. So by this communal representation of Muslims leads to, in the year 1947, bifurcation of India. So because of the communal representation, divide and rule, because of the special constituencies to the Muslims, India divided into two independent countries such as India and Pakistan. That's why Lord Minto is popularly known as father of communal representation. By this act, for the first time in India, the Britishers introduced indirect election system in India. For the first time, they introduced election system by this Act 1909. That was indirect election, not direct election. Direct election introduced by 1919 Government of India Act. Later we will discuss. But here, by the Act of 1909 Indian Council Act, they introduced for the first time in India by the indirect manner. That means that was indirect election system. They are introduced in India. Then this act facilitated one Indian to be nominated to the Governor General's Executive Council. Here, one Indian for the first time, Executive Council of the Governor General allowed to one Indian. Here Satyendranath Tagore. Satyendranath Tagore, he was the first Indian to be nominated to the Governor General's Executive Council. This is also one of the development which is by Government of India Act 1909 or Indian Council Act 1909. Then it increased deliberative functions of the legislative councils. The Government of India Act 1909 increased deliberative discussions functions of legislative council. Before the 1909 Minto-Marley Act, the legislative councils have what about the limited functions of the discussion regarding to the bills. That means the deliberative functions are limited only before the 1909. Whereas for the first time, this act increased deliberative functions of the legislative councils. So these are the main provisions of the 1909 Act, that was Minto-Marley Reforms Act. In examination point of view, the Board of Intermediate asked this one as 2 marks one. That's why you have to concentrate these main provisions. Okay, at the time of your presentation, you have to mention any two or three main provisions in examination. So this is about main provisions of 1909 Act. I thought everyone is clear. Then we will go to the next act, Government of India Act 1919. This is also one of the important development regarding to the constitutional provisions in India. So by this act is popularly known as the Government of India Act 1919. Act popularly known as Montague-Chelmsford Act. Montague-Chelmsford Act. Which act is popularly known as Montague-Chelmsford Act? Government of India Act 1919, popularly known as Montague-Chelmsford Act. Here, who is the Montague and Chelmsford? Here, Lord Montague is the Secretary of State for India, and Lord Chelmsford, he was the Viceroy and Governor General of India at that time. So they contributed for the development of Government of India Act 1919. That's why on the name of Montague-Chelmsford, this act is called as Montague-Chelmsford Act 1919. So this is a very important in examination point of view, because there are so many changes placed by the Act of Government of India Act 1919. Here, this act formulated based on the declaration made by Montague. Who is the Montague here? Montague is the Secretary of State for India at the time. So, based on the declaration made by the Montague in the British Parliament towards establishment of a responsible government in India, because the extremist leaders asked to self-rule, that was a responsible form of government by home rule or Swadeshi movement. You know that they made Swadeshi movement at the same time home rule movement for self-rule. That's why on the request of the extremist leaders, for satisfying the extremist leaders, Montague announced or declared in the British Parliament in the year 1917, that was regarding to the establishment of responsible form of government in India. This is the little background of Government of India Act 1919. Let us try to understand important provisions of or main provisions of Government of India Act 1919. So this act relaxed the central control over the provinces by separating central and provincial subjects. So before the Government of India Act 1919 Act, there was no separation of provincial subjects, nothing but the state subjects, central subjects. Here, all the subjects, all the administrative powers enjoyed by the central government. So, for the first time in India, by this act, they separated central subjects, at the same time provincial subjects. That's why here they relaxed central control over the provinces. Central control over the provinces, that means states may enjoy the freedom for making rules and regulations, nothing but laws. So this act introduced diarchy system at the provincial level. So for the first time, Government of India Act introduced diarchy system. What is the diarchy system? Diarchy system is nothing but the dual system, dual government system. So this is a very important thing here. Under this system, the administrative subjects were divided into reserved subject, transferred subjects. You know already we separated central subjects, provincial subjects. Central subjects not classified under this act as reserved and transferred. That means diarchy system not introduced at central level by this act, but where they introduced at provincial level. The provincial subjects again classified into reserved subject, transferred subject. Reserved and transferred. What are the reserved and transferred? Here the reserved subject, which are the important subject ministries like finance, like irrigation, like health. That means the subjects which are more powerful and income oriented, at the same time less responsible, enjoyed by the governor general and his council. That means these subjects are enjoyed by the britishers, whereas the transferred subjects which are less income oriented and the more responsible oriented, such as local government and also welfare ministries, these are enjoyed by the Indian ministers. Here what is the intention of the britishers? Here the reserved subjects vested with the british ministers, and the transferred subject vested with the Indian ministers. So this is the system of diarchy. Diarchy system introduced at which level? Provincial level. So this is the divide and rule policy. British ministers enjoyed the ultimate powers, whereas the Indian ministers who are enjoyed the transferred subjects having limited powers. Okay, so this is also one development, one provision introduced by Government of India Act 1919. Then the next one is that this act introduced bicameralism for the first time at central level. You know that what is mean by bicameralism? We studied in first year. Bicameralism is the dual house. That means the legislature which contains two houses such as upper house, lower house is called as bicameralism. So this is the first time in India Britishers introduced bicameralism, a bicameral system. At which level? Central level. Upper house called as Council of States. Upper house called as Council of States. Lower house called as Legislative Assembly. Lower house called as Legislative Assembly. You know very well. Now we have Parliament of India at central level. That was contains two houses, upper house, lower house. Upper house of Parliament of India called as Rajya Sabha. Lower house of the Parliament of India called as Lok Sabha. Rajya Sabha, Lok Sabha. So that's why here, after the attainment of the independence, after formulation of our own constitution, we introduced bicameral system. But the first time in India, for the first time in India, Britishers introduced bicameralism by the act of Government of India Act 1919. So you know that? I thought it's clear. Bicameralism means the legislature which contains two houses such as upper house, lower house. Upper house, lower house. Upper house is called as Council of States. Even now also the Rajya Sabha called as Council of States. Okay, then lower house is called as Legislative Assembly. And the next one is that provincial legislatures were to be unicameralism. That means there is no bicameral system introduced at provincial level. A provincial or the state legislatures are considered as unicameral legislature by the act of 1919. Then the next one is that it introduced direct election system. You know, already we discussed indirect election system introduced by 1909 Act, Minto Marley Act. But direct election system introduced for the first time in India by 1919 Government of India Act. And here they granted franchise right to vote. They granted right to vote or franchise to a limited number of people. By the act of 1919 they introduced direct election system, but they did not allow all the people to cast their vote. Whom they allowed? Here they granted franchise to the limited number of people. Tax, education. Property tax education. That means they allowed not to all the people. They allowed limited people to cost to enjoy the right to vote. So this is the one development which are introduced by 1919 Government of India Act. Then the next one is that this act extended the principle of communal representation to six Indian Christian, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. You know that for the first time in India, the communal representation introduced by 1909 Indian Council Act or Minto-Marley reforms. Whereas this communal representation extended to the six Indian Christian, Anglo-Indians, Europeans by the Act of 1919 Government of India Act. This is also one development, one important provision. Then the next one is that it separated for the first time provincial budgets from central budgets. So before the 1919 Government of India Act, there was no separate budget for the provincial government, that means state government, whereas for the first time the Government of India Act 1919 separated central budget and provincial budget. That means provinces, that means state enjoyed the power on their own budget. So this is a development which are introduced by 1919 Government of India Act, that was separation of provincial budgets from the central budget. Then the next one is that it had a provision to establish a statutory commission to inquire into the working and progress of this act in a periodical manner. At the end of the Government of India Act 1919, it included one provision, that was at the after the implementation of the 1919 Government of India Act, the British government established one statutory commission which are appointed by the British government, nothing but the Parliament of Britain, to inquire the working and progress of this Government of India Act 1919. So based on this provision only, that's already Simon, we discussed in national movement, that was Simon Commission appointed under this provision only for inquiring working and progress of the Government of India Act 1919. So these are the main provisions of the Government of India Act 1919. So let us try to understand the importance of this act in examination point of view. In examination point of view, sometimes this question expected as 5 marks one. That's why you have to concentrate on the brief introduction of 1919 Act. At the same time, the main provisions, at least 5 or 6 main provisions you have to mention in examination point of view. So this is about Government of India Act 1919. You know very well, in examination point of view, these two topics are very essential, such as Indian Council Act 1909 and the Government of India Act 1919. So you have to try to understand these important acts which are development of the Indian Constitution, which are undercomes development of the Indian Constitution. Okay, so what type of questions we expected from this area? One is 2 marks one, that was Minto Marley Reforms Act, or nothing but the 1909 Minto Marley Reforms Act. The next one is that 5 marks one we expected from this area, that was 1919 Act, main provisions of 1919 Act. Explain the or mention the main provisions of the 1919 Government of India Act. So these are the important questions from this area. At the time, if they ask 2 marks questions, you have to mention one or so two or three provisions of the questions or act at the same time. If they asked 5 marks one, you have to mention at least 5 or 6 provisions for the Government of India Act 1919. Okay, I thought everyone is clear. So let us try to understand next act.